A rental property can cost a lot of money, usually anywhere from tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Well, the good news is there are a lot of financing strategies and loan programs out there where you can use someone else's money to at least cover a big chunk of the purchase price. But there's still the question, how much money will you actually need to come out of pocket or out of your bank account to buy this rental property? There are the obvious things like your down payment, but then there's some not so obvious and hidden costs that you want to make sure you have the money for. Well, in this video, I'm going to use my 18 years of experience buying investment properties. I currently own over 100 units. I'm going to show you all of the actual things you need to be prepared for, and I'm going to give you some real world examples so that you know exactly how much cash and money you need to come up with to buy your next rental property. If you like this topic, be sure to hit that like button, and we're getting started right now. Welcome to Coach Carson TV. My name is Chad Carson. You can also call me Coach, and this is a channel all about investing in real estate, achieving financial independence, and doing more of what matters. Each Friday we come out with a new video, so be sure to hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you don't miss anything. As I often do on this channel, I'm going to go behind the camera, use my whiteboard clipboard to explain to you how much money you need when you buy a rental property. Let's get started. Okay, I want to start with a simple list of the things you're probably going to have to spend some cash on. The first is your down payment. The second are closing costs. The third are repairs or upgrades to the property. The fourth is holding costs. And then the fifth are reserves. Now, I'm going to go into each one of these and explain them a little bit more so you understand both what they are and how much they cost. Let's talk about down payment. First of all, what is it? So I like to think about this in a visual form. Like assume you're filling up a bucket. Like when you buy a property, for example, for $100,000, the seller of the property, they want their $100,000 from you. And if you go to the bank and borrow money, they will give you a portion of that. And we're going to talk about how much they'll give you in certain cases. But let's say they give you this much of the money from that bank or that lending institution. Well, the balance of that is your down payment. That's what you have to come up with as part of the purchase price. So you can think about it visually that way. Now, how much do you have to put down? That depends on your situation and the loan program. The first thing it depends on, are you an owner-occupant? Are you going to live in the property? So live in, or is it purely an investment? Because if you're a live-in, so let's say you're doing a house hack or you're just going to move into a property and one of these days when you move out, you eventually keep it as a rental or maybe you'll sell it, you could get what's called an owner-occupied loan. And there's several different programs out there. Some of the ones that have the lowest down payment are what's called the VA, Veterans Administration loan, if you happen to be a veteran of one of the military services. Or another one that a lot of people don't talk about is called a USDA, that's U.S. Department of Agriculture. And if you're outside of the big cities, this could come into effect. And even me, I'm in Clemson, South Carolina. Part of our market, even though we're halfway between Charlotte and Atlanta, we're near Greenville, South Carolina, which is pretty metropolitan and has some urban areas, there are pockets that qualify for USDA. So check that out. Go to the USDA website, see if your area happens to be in there. If so, you could get a 0% down loan, or if you're selling properties, you could help your buyers get a USDA loan. So that's one option. FHA is another government insured loan. That's the Federal Housing Administration. And you can get a 3.5% down payment on an FHA loan. There are some other costs, which we'll talk about in some of the next sections. And then if you're an owner-occupant, you can get what's called a conventional loan. Most of the conventional loans are are conforming to what's called the Fannie Mae standards. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are these big institutions who buy a lot of the mortgages, and people pretty much stick to some of their guidelines. So there are some loans outside of those guidelines, but if you stick to those, you can get what's in between a 5 and a 20% down payment. And there's a range there because if you put less money down, you'll have to get mortgage insurance, which is some extra cost to you monthly or upfront in order to protect the bank, because it's a higher risk when you put less money down in their perception. So that is the range there. But if you're owner-occupant, all of those are possible. If you're an investor and you're just purely going to be buying it as an investment, typically it's in the 20 to 30% range. Of course, there's some exceptions on either side, but if you're going to be a conventional investor getting like a 30-year or a 20-year or 15-year loan, that kind of falls into that conventional investor loan. And if you have good credit and good income, often you can get up to 5 or 10 of those. But then there's a whole nother universe of loans, all sorts of different kinds under the umbrella of commercial loans. And those often they would want to see a larger down payment for those as well. The next out-of-pocket costs you need to be aware of are closing costs. So these are the group of different costs that you're going to pay once you go to buy the property and have that appointment called a closing, where the actual transfer of the property occurs. Now, a real rough rule of thumb is that you might expect between 1 and 4% of the purchase price to be the total closing cost that you're going to have. On the low end, sometimes I have 1% if I'm buying a property with a private lender or using my own cash when I don't have a lot of financing costs. That's typically where I am. 4% on the higher end if you have some of the more expensive loan programs, FHA, some of those those I just talked about have a little bit more cost up front. Sometimes you'll see up to 4%. Now, what does that break down to? The better way to do this is to actually know what those costs are. And very often when you get an institutional loan, they'll give you a disclosure called a closing disclosure, or a loan disclosure, I believe is the name of it, or financing disclosure. Can't remember off the top of my head what that's called, but you can get a disclosure that breaks down what your likely costs will be. So definitely ask for that if you're getting a loan. But what is included? Typically, there's financing costs. So one section of those costs will be things that the bank charges you. Some of the more common are like origination fees. Sometimes they call them points. These are just upfront costs that they make money on, basically. There's going to be also some other fees they have that, like flood certification fees, and there's just a long list of them. You'll be surprised, but they're all included under that umbrella of financing cost. There are also going to be some costs that you'll want to have, or the bank will require you to have, in the example of an appraisal. So an appraisal fee, and then inspection fees. And sometimes I left this one off though, a survey fee. So if you want to have the property surveyed, which is often a good idea, all of those are third parties. So the appraiser's a third party, the property inspector's a third party, the surveyor, and they often are paid at closing. In addition to that, there are closing fees. So some states, that's going to be a title company who handles the closing, so who actually collects the money from the bank, who gives it to the seller, who makes sure all the loans are paid off. In other cases, in my state, for example, we have attorneys who do that and paralegals who work with them. So they get paid to handle all of that, what's called an escrow. So the escrow of all those documents and that money. And then in addition to that, there's a title search and exam fee. So there's somebody who's paid to go up to the courthouse records and search often 30, 40 years back to make sure you're actually getting a good title. So there's the person who searches for it, and then there's the attorney or somebody who examines all of those documents to make sure those are okay. And then this is optional, but I would say not optional. Most banks are going to require it. Even if they don't require it. You want to also get title insurance. So that's saying if they examine that and they miss something, that it protects you to make sure when you go to sell the property or get a loan later on, it's an insurance to help protect you in that case. So all of those, when you add them up, are under the umbrella of closing costs. When I give you an example later, you'll see what some of those actual costs are. The next cost you want to think about are repairs and upgrades. So these are the things you actually would spend money on after you buy the property to fix it up, to make it look nice. Maybe there's some deferred maintenance. And so the process here, and what I'm going to recommend, is that you build what's called a scope of work, which that's just a fancy term for a punch list, a list of all the things that need to be done to fix this property up. And then you have a sister document called a budget that basically puts numbers to that scope of work. So if you're a brand new beginner, you're going to have some learning to do. This is just one of those skills that you have to build. It's like building a muscle, like building endurance when you run. You've got to learn this skill. And my recommendation, the one that I use, this is the book that if I would have ever written a book on it, I would have written it just like this, but he did a much better job. The book by my friend Jay Scott called The Book on Estimating Rehab Costs. It's just one of those books you need on your shelf. It teaches you how to break down a property into component parts. So I believe he has 20 something component parts, like the roof system and the trim and the landscaping. And you learn how to estimate rehab costs. So that's a skill you want to build. Read that book, check him out. Jay's great. It's published by Bigger Pockets, but that is ultimately what you want to build. But the good news is, even if you're new, you can get help. And I would say even if you're experienced, you should get help. I still do this to this day after buying hundreds of properties. I use primarily 3 people to help me put together that scope of work and budget. Like, I'm the owner of that scope of work. I make it, but I asked 3 different people to help me put those together. The property manager, first and foremost. I have third-party managers who manage our rental properties. And so I want to get them to give me the perspective of the tenant. Like, what does the tenant need to have, or what's it need to be like, this property, in order to get the rent that we want and it's going to maximize the rent in our area? So they might tell me things like the layout of the property or the cosmetics. So, hey, this carpet really smells. We need to get that changed out. And so they can help you with those kind of things. They might identify some potential problems like in the condition of the property as well. But the next person, a property inspector, that's more their job. They might not understand really cosmetically what a property should look like to rent it for the maximum value, but they will go step by step through the attic, through the crawl space, through every piece of the property, looking at the electrical system, and tell you if there's any big red flags or problems that you should be aware of. And they'll put it into a nice, easy to read report with pictures that you can save and that you can send to other people. You can send to the third person, your contractor or contractors, who can then give you numbers. They can give you estimates of what some of those things will cost. So those three people are who I use. If you don't have a property manager, if you're managing it yourself, maybe you can this is why you need to network with other investors. And you can have some of them go out and look at the property with you. So there's some other landlords in your area. Even if you have to pay them to do it or take them out to a meal in the non-COVID times, and thank them for giving you some tips on what you need to do to get it rented to help you build that scope of work. But ultimately, that is going to help you not underestimate the cost it's going to take. Very rarely do you have zero in repair costs. If you buy a brand new property or maybe a turnkey, but even in that case, you need to be careful. When you buy a turnkey rental that's already fixed up, you always want to make sure you're estimating correctly and to give yourself a little bit of a cushion in that budget, a little overage just in case you miss something, because we often miss something. The next category of cost are holding costs. And this is one of those that's easy to forget. When I'm looking over other investors' shoulders and helping them run the numbers, this is often left off. They just don't think about it. But think about a real situation where you buy a vacant property that does not have a renter yet. That property is sitting vacant for how long? Maybe it's a month, maybe it's 3 months. If you have to fix the property up in particular, it's going to take some time to get it fixed. And then it's going to take some time until the first tenant moves in. Because even if you put it on the market on February 1st, it might take until 2 or 3 weeks to get a tenant, and then they might not move in for another 15 to 30 days. So you could have very realistically 1 to 3 months of vacancy time even if you're on the ball, even if you're getting things done. So what kinds of costs would you have while that property is vacant, while you're not collecting rent? You're going to have your loan costs, your principal and interest. Your mortgage company doesn't say, hey, I'm not going to let you pay while you're sitting there. Although this is an aside, I've negotiated with seller financing sometimes for my principal and interest payments not to start for 3 months for this very reason, just to save some of that. So that's just an aside. If you want to look at some of my videos on seller financing, that's one of the benefits. You also have property taxes. The local municipality doesn't stop charging you. And yes, you do pay that at the end of the year at one time typically, but you want to prorate that. You want to say, how much does that cost me every month? And what I do is I set aside taxes and insurance money in a separate account. Even if my mortgage company doesn't escrow it, which many of yours will, they'll collect it as part of the mortgage payment. And if you do, that means it's going to come out of your pocket. But if they don't collect it, you want to do that on your own. Both property taxes and insurance, that's a real cost while it's sitting vacant. HOA, the same way. If you have an HOA fee, utilities, you can probably have, especially in the winter, you have really high either electric or gas bills or both, water bills as well while you're fixing the property up, and then other things like lawn maintenance or miscellaneous costs. So these are things that are easy to slip by, but it can turn into several $1,000s or more if you don't think about them, and that's several $1,000 that you want to make sure you have set aside. Here is another cost that's going to be easy to forget. Many people overlook this, and it's to have cash reserves. So cash reserves are that what happens if money, that rainy day money, which we often talk about having personally, but you should also have it for a rental property. So this is one of those not sexy things. You're just going to have to set the money aside in a savings account that doesn't make much interest. That can be frustrating, but this is the kind of thing that in a worst case scenario gives you resilience. It helps you be anti-fragile, to use a Nassim Taleb phrase. If you ever read those books, they're really good. But it helps you in a worst case scenario, or often what happens when you underestimate some other cost. So what should you set aside? This is going to be a personal decision. If you're very conservative, you might want to do even more than this. But at a minimum, I would say 3 months of expenses. So when you total up all those expenses we just covered on the holding cost, so your principal and interest, your taxes, insurance, HOA cost, things like that, you should have 3 months, maybe, but I would say closer to 6 months of expenses totaled up or set aside in a reserve account. Or at a minimum, I would say about $5,000 per property. At least that's what I do. So, you're going to have to, again, do what you're comfortable with. I say $5,000 per property because think about the kinds of problems that might happen that where you want to make sure you have some cash and you don't have to go borrow the money or use a credit card or something. What if you have a heating and air goes out? Or what if the roof leaks or you have an old roof and you got to replace it? So some of the big costs are going to typically cost, like a heating and air, maybe you'd have to replace a unit or do something anywhere from $1,000 on the small end just for some parts, or to replace the whole thing, it's going to be closer to $5,000. So there's nothing magic about that number, but it just gives you a cushion in case something like that happens. Adjust as needed for whatever you're comfortable with. I would say you also want to be more than $5,000. If it's going to be higher, if you have old properties, really old properties with a lot of problems that could come up, and if it's very obvious you're going to have looming capital expenses. So if the driveway looks like it's about to fall apart, if the roof is under 5 years left on its life, things like that. Hopefully you've put those in your upfront repairs, but if you didn't, you'd want to save even more just in case those kind of things happen, because older properties cost you more money to hold and maintain. And also if you have multi-units, if you've got 4 or 6 or 10 heating and air units, that's going to cost you more in a worst case scenario. So I might cushion that a little bit more than $5,000. That would work on maybe a single family house, a duplex, something like that. So cash reserves. How much you put in there is going to be up to you. My main point is you need to set that aside as part of your cash up front. Now let's transition from the things you actually need to save money for to an actual example where I show you the numbers of what it's going to cost you up front out of pocket. In this first example, I'm going to assume you buy a property for $150,000. So that's the negotiated purchase price on your contract with the seller. Now you also assume that you get a 20% down payment with your lender. So 20% of $150,000 is $30,000. Let's also assume that because it's a institutional lender, you're gonna have about 3% closing costs when you total up all those various things that we went over. And so that 3% is $4,500. We're also gonna assume that you have repairs, and this is actually a pretty low number, I would say in my experience, but this could be something like painting and improving the landscaping and doing some odds and ends that you find on your inspection report. So $7,500 is our assumption there. Holding cost, remember these are all those things that you might hold if the property is vacant, you're gonna have to still pay for, and they'll say that's $3,000, and then reserve $5,000 you're gonna set aside in a savings account. Now, yes, you're not spending that yet, but that money needs to be there. So you know that that's gonna be part of your budget. And that's really the whole point here. It's not that maybe the holding costs are $2,850. Like, we're not being exact here, but what you want is the budget when you're buying this property. So when you're negotiating to buy it, you'd want to do this to make sure you have enough cash. And if you had $35,000 and not $50,000, that would be a major problem. You'd want to make sure that you have $50,000. And if you didn't, you'd either have to partner with somebody or you'd have to wait until you could come up with the money to actually buy the property. So that is the point. Let's look at one other example with slightly different numbers. In this example number 2, let's assume that you find a house hack. You're going to be an owner occupant. So you can do a house hack on like a duplex, for example, and you pay a little bit more. You're in a nicer area. You pay $300,000. And again, $300,000, nice area, depends on what part of the country you're in. If you're in San Francisco, that's going to be like 2 or 3 times that. If you're in my area, this would be actually a pretty nice duplex to buy for $300,000. But of course, that range depends. But the point of this is, in a house hack, you have an owner-occupant loan, which you can get a little bit smaller down payment. So let's say you use a FHA loan, and you get a 3.5% down payment, which in this case would be $10,500. And let's say you had 4% closing costs because you have a little bit higher fees there. That would be $12,000. And let's say there's not a lot of repairs. You want to do a few little upgrades, but everything's move-in ready in your unit. One unit's rented. You're going to move into the other unit. That's $5,000 in repairs. You don't have any holding costs because the other side's already rented and you're moving into the property. And then you have a $5,000 reserve. So in this case, you have a $32,500 total out-of-pocket cost. Now, the interesting thing and kind of the takeaway here, even though this is a low down payment program, $10,500, there's about 3 times more cost total than there are just in the down payment. So even if you had a 0% down payment, that would take you to $22,500 instead of $32,000. But there are often other things. You can negotiate some of these, like the seller, for example. You might be able to negotiate for the seller to pay some of your closing costs, maybe even all of your closing costs. So maybe you can get that negotiated. Maybe there's some repairs that you find that you can negotiate for the seller to do. Maybe you can get that down. The reserve, you need to have, that's your money. So you're always gonna have some money for the reserves, but it is possible through negotiation, through using other financing strategies like seller financing. I have found that when I have gotten seller financing, that they often want a down payment. So very rarely do you get a 0% down payment. But the point is, this isn't set in stone. Loan programs are often set in stone, but you can look at different loan programs. You can negotiate with the seller to help you get some of the cost. You need to start off with, what do you have? How much money do you have in the bank? And then you run these numbers to see how much it's probably going to cost. And if there's a gap there, there's a gap between what you have and what it'll actually cost, that's when you need to get creative. You need to think about partnering with other people. Maybe you need to negotiate. Maybe you just need to be patient. I've had students that I've worked with who just waited 9 months, 12 months until they had enough cash. That doesn't sound real exciting or sexy, but that's just the truth sometimes, is that to be aware of what kind of cash you need to spend and to be patient to make sure you have enough. Because the worst case you can think of is running out of cash and you can't pay your bills, or you have a big repair that you can't do because you've run out of money. That's when investors get into trouble. Now, what I've showed you so far are the details of what you actually need to expect to come up with out of pocket when you buy a rental property. Now, the question you might have is it possible to have no money down, where you don't have any of your money out of pocket? My short answer is that's very rare, especially up front, to have no money down, just for the reasons I've already shown you with cash reserves, things like that. But I do need to mention, and I want to talk about a strategy because it's very popular now. A friend of mine, Brandon Turner over at Bigger Pockets, and then his co-host on the Bigger Pockets podcast, David Green, talk a lot about this and teach a strategy called the BRRRR Strategy, which stands for buy, remodel, rent, refinance, and repeat. Now, essentially what this is a way, if you buy the property correctly, if you buy it below value, or if you add value to the property, you fix it up, you do something to increase the value of the property, it is possible, not right up front, but eventually to have potentially a no money down deal. Not always, but sometimes. So let me show you how that would work. Let's say you buy a property for $100,000. That's your purchase price. And let's say all in, your cost, just like your repair costs and everything else, your holding costs, your closing costs are $50,000. Just real simple numbers. You're gonna have to come up with $150,000 cash between you, maybe some private loans, maybe because this is a fixer-upper, maybe you use like a hard money loan or a HELOC on your house or something, or use a private lender, which is a lot of what I've done over the years to buy fixer-upper properties like this. The point is, between your own cash and other people, you got to come up with $150,000. With the BRRRR deal, you buy it, you remodel it, you use that money to do those first two steps. You get it rented once it's fixed up and looks nice. And then typically 3 to 6 months down the road, it depends on the loan program, if you can get a new appraisal that shows that properties are now worth $200,000. That's the new value because you've added value, you fixed it up, you've done some new things to it. Then you could go to a bank and try to get a new, more long-term mortgage. And let's just say, for example, they would give you $150,000. It might plus or minus, might be a little bit lower. Some banks might do a little higher, but it's below. There's some equity between 150 and the $200,000 value. So that's what they would want to see. And so you refinance that. But look in this example, how much cash did you have up front? $150,000. How much was the refinance on the loan? $150,000. So it is possible to have no money down. And this happens, especially more experienced investors in the residential world and definitely even in the commercial world, where over time, maybe not 3 months from now, maybe even a couple years later, there are investors who want to conserve their cash to go to the next deal if they're trying to grow. They might do this kind of deal where they refinance and pull some or all of their cash back out. Is this going to happen every time? Are you going to be able to do this on your first deal? I don't necessarily think that's realistic, but it's definitely possible. And you should, if you are trying to conserve your cash, if you had $50,000 and that's all you had, and you wanted to buy 4 or 5 rental properties, this would be a great strategy to look for fixer-uppers, to fix them up, but instead of selling them, keep those fixer-uppers, refinance, pull out some or all of your cash, and then use that $50,000 to do the next deal and then the next. Should you do this forever? That's kind of where I break from the BRRRR strategy. It's a good short-term strategy to grow. But eventually, it's nice, I think, you can watch some of my other videos on this to pay some of your loans off or to not borrow and borrow and borrow. Eventually, go to a new phase of your career. But that's another time, another message for another video. But I wanted to share this with you because this is definitely related to the subject of how much it costs or how much cash you need to come out of pocket to buy a rental property. So now you know all the details of how much it costs to buy a rental property, how much money you're gonna have to come up with. If you want to have a takeaway, something to look at to review all of what I've covered in this video, I have a cheat sheet. You can get it below in the description of the video. That'll give you both the examples I covered and also just a list of these costs so that you don't forget them. You can get that, just click on the link below and get that for free. I also want to invite you to watch the next video, which is all about how to run the numbers on rental properties. And now that you know how much money you need, you might want to evaluate the property and understand all the financial tools of how to analyze a deal. So check out my next video. I go into depth, again, drawing it on the whiteboard to show you how to run the numbers. Thanks for watching Coach Carson TV. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you don't miss anything. We have new videos every Friday. I'll see you next time.